Peter Bergen has accomplished what few in his field have done. He's not only a print and broadcast journalist, he's CNN's national security analyst, but he's an executive at a Washington think tank, the New America Foundation, a documentarian, and a New York Times best-selling author. He's written several books, including Holy War, Inc., Inside the Secret World of Osama bin Laden, The Osama bin Laden I Know, The Longest War, the Enduring Conflict Between America and Al-Qaeda, Manhunt, the 10-year search for bin Laden from 9/11 to Abbottabad. And he has the rare distinction of being the only Western journalist to produce a television interview with Osama bin Laden. He's turned his attention to domestic terrorism, almost prophetically with the recent attacks in San Bernardino. With his new book, and it's called United States of Jihad, Investigating America's Homegrown Terrorists, and he'll be available to sign this after the lecture today. The former U.S. Homeland Security Secretary calls the United States of Jihad the best one-volume treatment of the current state of extremist jihadism in America. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my honor to introduce Peter Bergen.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, thank you, Jonathan, for that introduction. Thanks for the invitation to come to speak today, and thank you for coming this evening. So my book is really about a puzzle. The puzzle is why a decade and a half after 9/11, some Americans, not very many of them, luckily, continue to sign up for the ideology of ISIS or groups like it. When you think about it, it's really a sort of a form of treason. After all, it's pretty clear what ISIS's objectives are. They include killing Americans, so why would an American join these groups? And I spent 2.5 years writing this book, and I will tell you, getting to the why is complicated. And everybody in this room has a personal narrative about how they got to where they are, and the different things that influence them, the happenstances, the historical current that we live in. But the more you know about each individual story, the more complex it actually becomes. So I have basically 4 points to make in my opening remarks before I take questions. One is, so who are these people? 2, why are they doing it? 3, what has the government done to make us safer? And 4, what does the future look like? And of course, that's also a difficult question to answer. Yogi Berra famously said, it's hard to make predictions, especially about the future. But I will try. So who are they? For the purposes of this book, myself and my research team assembled a database of 300 cases, 300 plus cases in the United States since 9/11 of people convicted or charged of a jihadi terrorist crime. Now, some of those crimes were relatively innocuous in the grand scheme of things, sending small amounts of money to an overseas terrorist organization, and some of them are very serious, murder or attempted murder. And when you average out all these cases, we find that 4 out of 5 of the people that we looked at are American citizens or American residents, legal permanent residents. So these are Americans. The second finding is their average age is 29. They're not the young hotheads of popular imagination, although ISIS recruitment has changed this a little bit. A third of them are married, a third have kids. Their average education is very similar to the average American. 50% of them graduate from high school. That's similar to the graduation rate in general in the United States. 10% of them have graduate study. That's exactly the same as graduate study rates in the United States. They're not criminals. They're not career criminals. Around 10% of them have spent time in prison. Around 9% of American males spend time in prison at some point in their lives. They're interestingly more sane than the general population. I mean, the rates of mental illness seem to be below the rates of serious mental illness in the population, which kind of makes sense. If you're part of a terrorist group, you don't want people who have serious mental issues because it's a problem. And so, in sum, they're ordinary Americans. And they also, by the way, come from all ethnic persuasions: Caucasians, African Americans, Middle East, South Asia. I mean, the one thing they have in common is that they have embraced a militant form of Sunni Islam. So that who is relatively simple, and of course that's an average. And by the way, Jonathan mentioned in his introduction, of course, the events in San Bernardino, which happened so close to here. We came to that conclusion about the profile before that attack happened. And the people involved in that attack fit that profile perfectly. He was 27 and she was 28. They were married, they had kids. He was earning $70,000 a year working for the county health department. They both graduated from, they both had college degrees in technical subjects. They were ordinary Americans. He was born in Chicago, she was a legal permanent resident. So the most lethal attacks in the United States since 9/11 have been carried out by American citizens. And that's a kind of counterintuitive conclusion because of 9/11, 19 Arab hijackers, all foreign-born, came to the United States and attacked us. And so we tend to think of terrorism as something that comes from the outside. Well, in fact, Major Nidal Hassan, who killed 13 people at Fort Hood, was born in Arlington, Virginia. He was an Army major. The San Bernardino couple, he was born in Chicago. She was a legal permanent resident. Carlos Bledsoe, who killed an American soldier at Little Rock, Arkansas in 2009, comes from a middle-class African-American family. His father runs a relatively successful tour business in Memphis. The Boston Marathon bombers, the two brothers, one was an American citizen, the other one was a legal permanent resident. And so, one of the reasons I'm focusing on the American story is, and I'll get to this a little bit later, is we have made it very hard to get into the United States if you're a foreign terrorist now. And I'll enumerate our defenses. So what we're left with are people who are already here. So the why, because the who I kind of explained. Why is a very tough one, because the more you look into these cases, and I looked at a dozen in some detail, and I was able to talk to family members. In one case, I had a 100-page letter from one of the perpetrators. He was now in Florence, Colorado, which is a supermax prison in Colorado. So I was able to build up, and also some of these cases go to trial. And trials are great for reporting because trials produce cross-examinations of witnesses. They produce thousands of pages of documents. And so, through these different cases, I can, there are different ways of looking at it. One is, my wife is from Louisiana, so I'm going to use a Louisiana metaphor for this one. So when you make a gumbo, there's lots of different ways you can make it. I mean, more sausage, less sausage, do the roux a certain way, cook it longer, shorter. There's lots of different ways to make a gumbo. And so in this gumbo, there are several different factors, and for each person they can be more important or less important. So for Islamist militant ideology is clearly part of this. A desire for belonging to something bigger than yourself, a very common human impulse, is part of it for a lot of people. Objections to American foreign policy are clearly part of it. Some people have fun doing these things. I mean, it gives them a sense of purpose and meaning, and they actually enjoy it. Some people have personal disappointments, which provide what New York Police Department termed a cognitive opening that sort of turned them first to Islam. A lot of them were non-observant Muslims who had some kind of crisis, loss of a job, loss of a parent, feeling that Muslims were under attack. That provided a cognitive opening to go to a fundamentalist Islam, and then they went down the path to, eventually to militant jihad. Now, lots of people are ultra-fundamentalists, very few people are militant jihadis. So I'll give you some examples of what I'm talking about, because as you see, once you dig into the examples, everything becomes a lot murkier than it appears on the surface. So on the surface, Major Nidal Hassan, who killed 13 people at Fort Hood, Texas, is an Islamist zealot. He was highly observant Muslim, killed 13 American soldiers, 12 American soldiers and one civilian at Fort Hood. But I interviewed at some length his double first cousin, who is a quite successful lawyer in Northern Virginia. And they grew up, two Palestinian brothers married two Palestinian sisters, and they moved to the United States. And both of Nader and Nidal, the perpetrator of the attack, were born here. And now one is a successful lawyer in Northern Virginia with a beer in the fridge and describes himself as a secular Muslim. And the other one, with basically more or less the same set of cards, turned into a mass murderer doing this attack supposedly in the name of Islam. Now, his cousin said that Major Nadal Hassan was somebody who probably had never had a physical relationship with anybody. He was about to turn 40. He was very afraid of deploying to Afghanistan. He had really no friends to speak of. He had sought to find a marriage partner without much success. One of the questions he asked one potential marriage partner was, what would happen if he hit her? You know, and she was supposed to say, well, that would be fine. Of course, she didn't say that. And he was definitely afraid of deploying to Afghanistan. So his cousin says that Major Nadal Hassan sort of essentially went postal and sort of dressed it up in the garb of Islam in order to sort of be a heroic figure in his own story. And so to what extent is that to do with Islamist beliefs or something about the personal story of this guy? And surely it's a bit of Islamist beliefs, but it is also a lot to do with the personal story of this guy's disappointments. Now, I can say all that, and lots of people have personal disappointments. Lots of people come from broken families. Lots of people object to American foreign policy. Lots of people are ultra-fundamentalist Muslims who have no intention of doing anything violent. But why would somebody then go out and kill essentially 13 strangers in the service of what? I mean, so with the why, you can go down the path to a certain extent, but you get to a point where the why becomes very hard. And I got very interested in the emerging discipline of threat management, which, like a lot of inventions in the United States, started in California. And it started in Hollywood because Hollywood, a guy called Gavin de Becker, protected a lot of Hollywood stars in the 70s and 80s, and he began assembling a database of threats made against stars. Now, we know from the Jodie Foster deranged fan, Hinckley, who almost killed President Reagan outside the Hilton in Washington, we know that these people can be very dangerous. So the question, but lots of people make threats and then don't act on them. So there began to be an emerging discipline of threat management that really began in Hollywood, and then it kind of extended into the federal government, and is now, I went to the behavioral unit in Quantico to meet the FBI counterterrorism people, and they very much embrace this, and they say that they don't really care if somebody's a neo-Nazi or an Islamist militant, or they don't care what the motivation is. And this is one of the insights that de Becker had early on as protecting Hollywood stars. What you're really looking for is not what people are saying or their beliefs. What you're looking for are something that the FBI calls the pathway to violence. And the pathway to violence is a 6-stage pathway which starts with grievance, I don't like my wife's cooking, ideation, my wife's cooking could actually go away if she would actually go away. Planning and preparation, looking at the laws in the state about what would happen if she had a slip, and kind of just the beginning of that, and then the actual plan, and finally breach. Breach meaning sometimes you have to breach the target. So 9/11 hijackers practiced breaching airports before they did the attack, and then finally attack. And then added to that is the question of inhibitors. So if you're married and you have a family and you have a good job, you're less likely to go down this pathway to violence, although it's not impossible. Look at San Bernardino. This is all by way of saying one of the insights that one of the leaders in the field of threat management is a guy called Ted Calhoun. And one of the insights he had he also wrote with a guy called Steve Weston, who was in charge of the California Highway Patrol, which is charged with basically California state officials protecting them. And they made, I think, an incredibly important point, which is the why may not be fully understood by the perpetrator himself. He may not be able to fully articulate it. And if you look at Jahar Sarniev in the Boston Marathon attacks, the younger brother, when he came to trial, he really said nothing. And when he was thinking that he was dying, he scrawled in the boat in which he was hiding in the Boston suburbs something about American foreign policy. But it was, this guy's not an Islamic scholar by any stretch. I know more about Islam than he does, and I don't know very much about Islam. This was a kid that was dropping out of college, smoking a lot of weed, drinking a lot of Hennessy, tweeting about the girls he was chasing. He's not an Islamic scholar. And so why did he do it? The why becomes complicated because, yes, he was influenced by his brother, it seems. But at a certain point, you can only get so far with the why. Now, maybe if I was a novelist and Joseph Conrad wrote about a group of terrorists in London at the turn of the century called the Secret Agent, and he kind of got inside their minds. Maybe if I was a filmmaker, I could do a better job, but I'm tethered to the facts. And you get to a point where the why is hard to disentangle. one other sort of set of anecdotes along that line. Omar Hamami, very bright kid from Daphne, Alabama. Has anybody been to Daphne, Alabama? Indeed. So it's a very, very small town in the Bible Belt outside Mobile. And Omar, his mother is a devout Baptist and his father is a Syrian Muslim who was an engineer for the state, very bright guy. Omar grew up as a Baptist and then was converted to Islam. He went to Damascus when he was 15 and he had a sort of St. Paul on the road to Damascus conversion moment to Islam. And, praying publicly, the 5 prayers at a high school in the rural South is going to draw a lot of attention. If you're part of a Christian prayer circle, it's one thing. So, but Omar kind of flaunted. He was, before he'd converted to Islam, he was dating the prettiest girl in the school, very bright guy. He and his best friend both convert to Islam. Then they become, they start observing a more ultra-fundamentalist form of Islam. They change the way they dress. They only hang out with people who share their views precisely. The next step is they marry somebody who shares their views precisely, who's outside their social milieu, and they also they cut off their families, essentially. Now, that is a very good description of cult behavior. When I was in the middle of this, I emailed Larry Wright, who wrote the great book Going Clear about Scientology, and I said, to what extent is this cult-like behavior? And it's very similar. People join cults, do this. They hang out with people who share their ideas precisely. They marry somebody who shares their ideas precisely. They stop dealing with their families. So Omar is the star of this story, Omar Hamami. I'll tell you what he did in a minute. And then his best friend is called Bernie Culveyhouse. Now, Bernie Culveyhouse now lives in Silicon Valley, in Palo Alto. He has 3 kids. He has a good job working as in the tech business, and he's alive. Omar Hamami joined Shabab, the Somali terrorist group, became one of its leaders, and Shabab eventually killed him, and he's dead. Now, the reason I'm telling you this story is these are guys who converted to Islam exactly at the same time. They then became more and more ultra-fundamentalists at exactly the same time. They both married Somali sisters who shared their views more or less precisely. They moved to Canada, Toronto, where it's a long way from Alabama. They wanted, suddenly in Canada they began hearing criticisms of American foreign policy. This was at the height of the Iraq War. And then they decided to be real Muslims, they had to immigrate to the Middle East to really speak Arabic perfectly because they planned to become religious scholars. They go to Alexandria, Egypt. It's not the paradise they thought it was going to be. In fact, they were living in quite an unpleasant apartment. Omar both of them began flirting with the idea of going to Somalia to fight with al-Shabaab. In fact, they had code words for it. But Bernie Culveyhouse, because he had a wife and a daughter, and his father had abandoned him when he was a child, didn't go to Somalia. He returned to the States. Omar Hamami, whose parents are together, who also had a wife and a child, that wasn't enough to stop him. He went to Somalia. I say all that because these decisions are intensely personal. We have an almost perfect example here of people who went down the same path, but one stopped. So when Omar gets to Somalia, he becomes a leader of al-Shabaab. You may recall, I don't know if you recall, he was in a lot of videos that Shabaab put out. He was sort of rapping very bad raps about Islam and missiles. And he appeared in a lot of videos because he's a good-looking guy. He speaks he's American. It's a big propaganda coup. He was very active on Twitter. He was one of the first people to really use Twitter, which is relevant to what's happening today. He live tweeted his own an assassination attempt against him. He's probably the first person in history to live tweet somebody trying to assassinate him. And in the end, he was killed by Shabab. So that's a way of saying that the why is very, very complicated. And at the end of the day, it's a very individual decision. So I've told you about the who, told you about the why. Then what has the government done to protect us since 9/11? And if we'd had this discussion in 2002, and I said that in the next decade and a half, 45 Americans would be killed by jihadi terrorists in the United States, that would have seemed like an absurdly optimistic prediction. Obviously, we had the San Bernardino tragedy, but we were expecting another 9/11 or something close for many years thereafter. And that didn't happen. And the reason it didn't happen is, whether it's the Bush or the Obama administrations, there has been a great effort to keep terrorists out of the country. And I'll give you some data to show how things have changed. So in 9/11, there were 16 people on the no-fly list. Now there are 47,000. There are 1.5 million people on a much larger list called the Tide list, which, if you have any kind of even putative connections to any kind of terrorist group, you're on this list, you would go into secondary screening if you try to get on an American-bound flight. On 9/11, the FBI and the CIA did not really talk to each other, which is fairly astonishing. The CIA knew that 2 members of Al-Qaeda were in San Diego for about 9 months before they bothered to tell the FBI on August the 25th. Those were 2 of the hijackers who crashed into the Pentagon. On 9/11, there was a failure to connect the dots before. Now we have all these institutions that are designed to connect the dots. So we have the National Counterterrorism Center, which is people from around the government working in Washington to analyze threats and trends that they're across the intelligence community. We have TSA. You may not like TSA, generally speaking, but the fact is it's going to be, terrorists are deterred from putting bombs and weapons on planes now in the United States. We have the FBI there were something like 30 joint terrorism task forces around the country. On 9/11, now there are more than 100. On 9/11, there was no DHS, which is the second largest government entity after the Pentagon. And the list goes on and on. The intelligence budget on 9/11 was $28 billion. It's now $80 billion. And that's just our defensive capabilities. And then add to that public knowledge. That's a huge force multiplier to everything I've just said, because the public was not concerned about terrorist attacks in any meaningful way before 9/11. And now the public is quite engaged in the issue, otherwise you wouldn't be here listening to me. When the underwear bomber got on Northwest Flight 253 and tried to detonate a bomb in his underwear flying over Detroit, when smoke started pouring out of his crotch, the passengers and crew disabled him because they know that that's not what's supposed to happen on flights. And similarly, when a SUV was driven into Times Square on May 1st, 2010, on a warm Saturday night, driven by Faisal Shahzad, who are recruited by the Pakistani Taliban, who had the wonderful previous job of working as a financial analyst for the Elizabeth Arden Cosmetics Company, not a hotbed of jihadism generally. When he tried to detonate the bomb, it was a street vendor who called the cops and said there's an SUV smoking. So all our defensive capabilities add to that public knowledge, and then add our offensive capabilities, which we have put huge costs on Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda, the central, the group that attacked us on 9/11, is out of business. We killed its leader. We've killed dozens of other leaders. They've never had a successful attack in the United States since 9/11. They've had one successful attack in the West, which was the London attacks of July 7th, 2005, which killed 52 commuters and was a big deal. It was the most deadly terrorist attack in British history. But the point is that they are largely irrelevant. And who's the best witness for that, by the way? It's Osama bin Laden himself. We've had, if you don't doubt this analysis, you can go and see there are thousands of pages of documents that have been released from the Abbottabad compound where bin Laden lived. And he had, I think, a very good appreciation for how bad the situation had become. He was thinking of moving his group from the Pakistani tribal regions to deeper into Pakistan or into Afghanistan, anywhere to get away from the drones. They were running out of money. He was very conscious of the fact, as the 10th anniversary of 9/11 came into view, that they had not succeeded in his main goal of attacking the United States again. And they painted an organization that understood it was under a lot of pressure. And certainly ISIS is a big problem, but we have also imposed very big costs on ISIS. They've already lost the city of Ramadi. We dropped a bomb on a bank that held $750 million of its currency about 3 weeks ago. The New York Post had one of the best headlines for a long time, which is "U.S. makes big deposit." And so they had to halve salaries. They had to halve the salaries of the ISIS fighters because they're running out of cash. We've also attacked a lot of their oil trucks. The momentum is shifting against them. I'm not saying that ISIS will be defeated a year from now or 2 years from now, but they're losing territory. They're running out of money. Running a 30,000-man army is an expensive proposition. Running a state is an expensive proposition. They make claims that they run a state. So our defensive capabilities, public knowledge, and then our offensive capabilities have certainly done a lot of damage to these groups. So then what does this all mean for people in this room, for the United States? I think there's good news and there's bad news. The good news is that you're left with threats from ordinary Americans like the San Bernardino couple or Major Nadal Hassan or Carlos Bledsoe, pick your choice. Their capabilities are very limited. I mean, Major Nadal Hassan had 4 assault weapons. He killed 13 people. He was not part of a conspiracy, as we saw in Paris, where there were 8 people who'd been trained in Syria. They had all been taught paramilitary tactics, and they killed 130 people in one evening. Similarly, so there's a natural ceiling to what lone wolves can do. They are hard to detect because they're not having meetings with fellow conspirators. The San Bernardino couple were had perfect operational security because they just talked to themselves when they were alone in their bedroom. Similarly with the Boston bombers, they were brothers. They also didn't have to involve anybody in that plan. So they're very hard to detect because they're not making phone calls to foreign terrorist organizations. They are not doing meetings that the FBI can detect. But that said, their capabilities are somewhat limited. So to summarize, we have a low-level persistent threat that is surprising that it continues to exist 15 years after 9/11. In 2015, there were more jihadi terrorism cases in the United States than at any point since 9/11. There were more than 60. Almost all of these are ISIS-related. Almost all of them are generated by what people are reading online. And that's a worry because, they can not only get inspired by ISIS, they can also be in direct messaging with ISIS as the two you may recall Garland, Texas, there were 2 ISIS-inspired guys. They were also in direct contact with ISIS over a direct message on Twitter, members of ISIS who were telling them kind of what to do. So if we see an attack again, similar to San Bernardino, my guess is we'll see that it's not only inspired by ISIS, but there may be some direction from overseas. And that's the bad news. The good news is, the limited capabilities of lone wolves. And we've really managed and contained the problem now in this election season. You're not going to hear that from politicians because the political costs of even being 1% wrong about this are very high. Just think about the political costs of 4 American deaths in Libya, in a country in the middle of a civil war, in a basically, lightly defended compound. The political costs to Hillary Clinton were very large. So you're not going to hear American politicians saying what is basically true, that we have largely managed and contained the threat. And that also, by the law of averages, they're going to get one through. I mean, these statements aren't in contradiction. They're just the facts of the matter. So, is that an optimistic prediction or a pessimistic prediction? I mean, one for the room. So with that, I'll take any questions.
Thank you very much, Peter. Peter will be, just as a reminder, Peter will be in the lobby to sign your books. But I'd like to just first ask you, what is the principal motivation of ISIS, for example? Is it Iran? Is it the Palestinian-Israeli issue? Is it all of the above?
Yeah, ISIS is not the problem. It's a symptom of a wider problem. There'll be maybe another group that we don't know its name of. The wider problem is a regional civil war between the Shia and the Sunni, which you can see in Iraq and in Syria and Yemen, that is financed by the Gulf and the Iranians, and that is the real problem. So ISIS is merely a symptom of this problem because they present themselves as the defenders of, basically, we will defend the Sunnis against the Shia. And it shows you how bankrupt the Iraqi government has been, that for Sunnis living in Western Iraq, I'm sure they don't love ISIS, but it seems somewhat preferable to the Iraqi government, which they see as an Iranian Shia-backed government that isn't dealing with their issues. So I think Shia grievance is kind of key to ISIS's success, but the other, in their propaganda, they also paint a very attractive picture of what it's like to come and live in the caliphate, which is an Islamic utopia, where you can get married to the man of your dreams or the woman of your dreams, where you can, they provide they have pictures of, welfare centers and children playgrounds. They show video of children at playgrounds. They paint a very kind of idealized picture of what it's like to live under ISIS control. And unfortunately, some people believe that. I mean, some of the people I profile in the book, there were 3 teenagers from Chicago, the Khan family, very bright, 19, 17, 16. They generally thought they were going to join an Islamic utopia. The FBI did a huge favor for them by arresting them at O'Hare Airport because going to Syria is incredibly dangerous. And my team and I have released a paper about ISIS in the West, and we looked at 475 cases of people who joined ISIS from the West, 25 countries. and half the men are dead, and 6% of the females, even though the females are not allowed to go out of the house, essentially. And it's a testament to how dangerous that war is. So when we're doing them a favor by arresting them at the airport, there is a question, though, should the FBI be telling parents, when they're teenagers without a history of violence and no allegation that they were going to commit an act of violence. Right now, the 19-year-old in this case faces 15 years in prison. This is a fairly substantial sentence for material support. Now, what is the material support? The material support is himself. The first person to be indicted in this way was John Walker Lind, a Californian, who actually is going to get out of prison pretty soon. But the material support that he provided was himself. He volunteered to fight for the Taliban, so that became a precedent, and that precedent has been used many, many times since. When you see the cases about ISIS, almost invariably, it's about people who want to join ISIS who are then charged with material support. But I do think that if somebody's not violent themselves and there is no allegation they were going to carry out an act of violence and they're a teenager, that 15 years is kind of a long sentence to be looking at.
We have a question in the fourth row.
Hi, Peter. Thank you for coming tonight. We appreciate you being here. And I was just going to say, when you said that we can't even be 1% wrong, it echoed something that Vice President Cheney said, the 1% doctrine. And I always respected that at the time of 9/11, but as we've gotten over a decade and a half past that period of time, I'm starting to wonder, do you believe that it's time for Americans to start accepting the idea that we can't catch and stop everything, especially these domestic attacks, and maybe we need to become more focused around education and basically coping with what happens when these things occur?
I think the demand signal from the American public is, zero. One of the people I interviewed for the book, and who also was in a film called Homegrown, which is based on the book, loosely adapted, is a guy called Andy Liebman, who's at RAND in Santa Monica now. And Andy was the CIA for 30 years. And he said, look, the message from the president and the public and Congress was there will be no other attack after 9/11. There's a scene in the book where President George W. Bush meets Robert Mueller, the new head of the FBI, for the first time. Mueller had taken the job a week before 9/11. They'd never met. And Mueller was obviously, understandably a little anxious about meeting the president for the first time, particularly trying to explain what the FBI was doing after 9/11. And he gave the president a kind of presentation about what they were doing at the crime scenes and the links to Al-Qaeda. And at a certain point, George W. Bush interrupted Mueller and said, Bob, that's what the FBI has been doing for time immemorial. That is not your job. Your job is not to solve this crime, although clearly you should do that, but your job is to prevent this from ever happening again. That was the message, and that message came from the American public, the president, the Congress, and the outgrowth of that is probably a certain amount of overkill, a certain amount of overspending. I mean, here's a data point that's interesting. On 9/11, 1 out of 10 of the richest counties in the United States were in Washington, D.C. region. Today, it's 7 out of 10. So wars are good for Washington. There was a giant transfer of money to Washington for national security, defense, and I'm trying to undo that. I mean, one thing you don't hear is, let's reduce the counterterrorism budget. And by the way, I think it would be politically impossible for any candidate or any elected official to say, yeah, I'm going to really reduce the counterterrorism budget. I mean, that is just basically a non-starter. So I don't disagree that this is not a rational discussion necessarily. 80% of Americans are very or somewhat worried about a terrorist attack that could kill them or their family members. I mean, there's a lot of fear about this, even though the fear is simply irrational. But fear is irrational. I mean, we're walking around with the brains we had 20,000 years ago that helped us survive in the jungle and deserts. And, fear is a very dominant part of our brains. And 9/11 was one of the hinge events of American history. So I don't see anybody sort of saying we should reduce the counterterrorism budget, even if there's plenty of fat probably in there that could be reduced.
We have a question in the second row.
2 questions. The first is, I recently heard a local imam from one of the local mosques talking about how the Islamic terrorists in America were really not as serious a problem as we make them out to be, because there were more Christian organizations blowing up Planned Parenthood organizations and the Nazi groups. What does your data show?
Well, the data is very, the data is that extreme anti-government fanatics, anti-abortion fanatics, they kill people at about the same rate as jihadi terrorists in the United States. So we've had, you can go to our website, New America, where I work. I mean, we document with every case. There are 48 deaths since 9/11 by neo-Nazis, and these stories don't get as much attention, they get some attention. You know, a neo-Nazi attacked a Jewish community center in Kansas City, killed 3 people in 2014, you may recall, 3 Jewish victims. And he shouted Hail Hitler afterwards. Now do the thought experiment where he shouted Allah Akbar afterwards. That would have been it was not a small story, but it would have been a seismic story. So, you know, we were prisoners of our own history. 9/11 was one of the hinge events of American history. We tend to filter everything through that. Yet, if 9/11 hadn't happened, the last big terrorist attack we'd be concerned about was a federal city building in Oklahoma City, in which 168 people were killed in 1995, which was, to that point, the most deadly terrorist attack in American history. And of course, that was by Timothy McVeigh, who was a member of, you know, these kind of far-right extremist organizations. So, as a factual matter, that's true. I mean, there's lots of forms of political violence in this country. There's relatively easy access to weapons. So if you have a beef about some ideology, it's not a problem to get a weapon. And, you know, by the way, the golden age of terrorism in the United States was in the 1970s. In many senses. I mean, there wasn't one massive attack as we had on 9/11, but the Weather Underground were blowing people up and killing people. The Black Panthers were killing policemen. Puerto Rican separatists were blowing up bombs. Hijackings were routine. There were more than 100 hijackings in the 1970s. Many of them, some of them criminal, some terrorist. But the hijackings disappeared until 9/11. So it's sort of ahistorical to think that jihadi terrorism is the only form of political violence that affects America. I mean, the deadliest attack in New York City before 9/11 was an Italian anarchist who blew up it was like one of the first vehicle-borne IEDs. It was a cart, and they killed at least 20 people outside the JP Morgan Bank. That's all by way of saying America has had plenty of forms of political violence domestically. And since, if you accept my case, that it's much harder for a foreign terrorist group to attack us now, we're going to see this relatively low-level persistent threat, both from neo-Nazis and jihadi terrorists, who often,
We have a question in the back row.
Concerning the Iranians, how much influence do they have on the ISIS group?
Zero. I mean, no. I mean, look, they regard, ISIS is a Sunni fanatical organization that regards Shia as heretics, and they routinely show the brutal executions of Shia because they consider them to be heretics. So, there is no Iranian support for ISIS. In fact, there is Iranian support for Hezbollah that's fighting ISIS. And one of the reasons President Obama didn't intervene in Syria was the 2 most effective fighting forces back, say, in 2013 were al-Qaeda and Hezbollah, and they were fighting each other, and they're both American enemies of one kind or another. So Iran is on the other side of the fence from ISIS.
Okay, we have time for 2 more questions.
Hi, Mr. Bergen. Thank you for coming to speak tonight. It's a real pleasure. I have like a 2-part question concerning ISIS and the Islamic State that you touched on. Do you see any correlation or any things relatable to like a Fortune 500 company, just because you mentioned the fact that they have payrolls that they need to meet, other expenses, and just to keep propaganda going? And also, do you feel that maybe they are growing too big too fast, and with the announcement of a caliphate and expanding their borders, does that make them more of a target for other forces like the EU, NATO, just not America?
Yeah. Well, if you take over the size of, they now control the 2nd largest city in Iraq. They have controlled territory about the size of the United Kingdom. They control several million people. That is a very rich target. Obviously, they're also hiding the population, so it's not like you can carpet bomb them, as some have suggested, because you'd be killing a lot of Iraqi civilians. But, it's a kind of paradox that by creating this state, they've both shown their power, but they've also induced a 60-member coalition that's fighting them. Winston Churchill famously said the only thing worse than having a coalition is not having one. And, coalitions, obviously, not all we're doing most of the work, we the United States, but the Jordanians are bombing, and there is an effort, and we're I think over time are going to constrict their territory. So they've kind of set themselves up for a potential defeat just by this very action. If they just defaulted to being a terrorist organization with no real headquarters, that's a harder target.
Question in the front row.
Hey, John. Good evening. I'd like to talk a little bit about the immigration issue in the EU right now, the millions that are coming in, coming from the region, and some may not be vetted properly, and how that can impact the culture in Europe and also eventually here.
Well, I think it's a great question, and there is no French dream, there is no British dream, there's no EU dream that I'm aware of. There is an American dream. It's worked very well for American Muslims. They tend to be as educated as every other American. On average incomes are similar. They don't live in ghettos, with very rare exceptions. The Somali population in Minneapolis lives in one of the poorest neighborhoods in the country, in Cedar Riverside, but that's an exception. But that's not the exception in France or Britain or Germany or pick your European country. And there's an astonishing statistic, which is 10% of the French population is Muslim, 70% of their prison population is Muslim. So you can see how there's a kind of criminalized underclass. And I think the immigration is going to be much worse, not because they're hiding as members of ISIS, although we've had a couple of examples of that, because when you have millions of people coming to these countries and you see the rise of far-right parties in France and Britain, in Hungary, there's a sort of proto-fascist prime minister. In Poland, these right-wing, all over Europe, people, countries like Sweden just sent back 80,000 refugees, and that's a country that is seen as very liberal. So these countries are not built on immigration. They have no way of sort of psychologically, ideologically to absorb them. And we're going to see a generation of people who, are not going to be accepted or imperfectly accepted, and some of them will turn to a form of militant Islam as a form of identity, because they'll be split. Am I French? Am I Muslim? Second generation. Look at the Charlie Hebdo attack. These guys they're French citizens. Look at the Paris attacks in November. These guys were French citizens. So the problem is much bigger in Europe. You can drive from Paris to Damascus. You can't drive from Yorba Linda to Damascus the last time I checked. So, we're protected by geography. We're protected by volume, because we've had 1,500 French citizens go to Syria. We've had maybe a few dozen Americans who've made it at most. So it's a much bigger problem in Europe. If we get attacked again, it's probably it's not impossible to be somebody with a British passport who has a legal British passport, not a Syrian passport, who, but it still doesn't invalidate the general proposition that we're largely insulated from this. It's it's a very big problem in the Middle East, and it's going to be a somewhat big problem in Europe going forward.
Thank you very much, Peter. Please give Peter Bergen a round of applause. Thank you.